Okay, it's a new day for me, hopefully not for you. Let's finish this poem. So, on to our third and fourth stanza. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. So when we're close reading poetry, you always want to ask yourself, what's weird about this stanza? Or is there any sort of repetition? Is there any word that I don't know what it means? Is there any word that seems out of place? So you remember what we just looked at in the first two stanzas. For example, immortality is a weird word to use when you're talking about death. So is kindly. So is civility. Those words are used on purpose to make you think of death as a gentleman and as something that's associated with being immortal rather than being mortal. Okay, so those words are used very purposefully. They're not put there by accident. And we see the same thing in these two stanzas. So looking at the first one, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Hopefully you've noticed that there is some repetition. We. When you start a sentence or when you start multiple sentences with the same word, that's the literary device called anaphora. Anaphora, sorry. So this is the repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a clause. Sorry, it's not just we that's repeated, it's we passed, we passed, we passed. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a single word for it to be considered anaphora. It can, like I've written down, the repetition of a word or a phrase. So we passed, we passed, we passed. And of course, nothing is done by accident in poetry and or literature. So what does the repetition of the phrase we passed, we passed, we passed, what does it suggest? The repeated phrase we passed serves to illustrate the constant forward motion of the chariot. So it's easy to forget that in this poem it's taking place inside a horse-drawn carriage. So we passed, we passed, we passed. It's used to remind the reader of where they are. It's supposed to be placed in this poem. Okay? It's perpetuating this forward motion. Also, the word we is a little strange to be using. So the we rather than saying he and I. So who is the author talking about when she says we? She's talking about herself and death. Rather than saying death and I passed the school, death and I passed the fields, death and I passed the setting sun, she conflates the two into one word, we. That's significant. So the we, rather than he and I, suggests that the narrator and death are now joined in some sort of way. At least in the mind of the narrator, they are for sure. Okay? Now there's a word in this stanza that doesn't make sense. This is where I'm sad that we're not doing it in class, because I wouldn't be just telling you guys these things in class. Hopefully you would, after a while, figure them out for yourselves. But hopefully there's a word here, either that you're not sure what it means, or you realize, hey, this doesn't belong. So we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. So they're passing a school where children are out for recess. And what do we usually do during recess? What do kids do? They play. Okay? So the word strove shouldn't be here if we're thinking literally. School children play at recess, but she's saying that they strove. Okay? The children strove. Why does she not use the word play? Well, in order to answer this question, we have to know what strive means in the first place. To strive, I'll just write it here. Strive means to struggle or to make a great effort. So it's the opposite of what playing means. Playing, it's lighthearted, it's fun, it's not work. Striving means it's hard, it's a struggle, and it's not something you're actually wanting to do. So for her to see a bunch of children who are playing out in the field, but for her to see it not as play but as strife and as something difficult, well, it suggests then that the narrator has a very pessimistic or sad perception of life and of what it means to be alive. She sees life as a struggle rather than as something to be enjoyed. I'm going to change that word. So they are thus, I'm talking about the children here. Let me just be more specific. The children, in the eyes of the narrator at least, give me a second. There we go. They are struggling against their peers rather than playing with their peers, which is an aggressive active deed. It's as though then we can say that the text suggests that the narrator sees life as a constant struggle. It is as though she is more comfortable with death than life. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about for that stanza here. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. Even the ring, right? That's a little strange. Instead of calling it a playground or a park, she's calling it a ring. What do we do in rings? People usually fight in rings. Okay, let me highlight that word. So by using the word strove and ring, they work together to elicit the same mental image in the reader's head. We don't see children playing when we read this, we see them fighting. Whether or not that's actually what they're doing, we don't know, but in the mind of the narrator, in the mind of this lady, that's what she actually sees. She doesn't see life as something to be enjoyed and to be playful and to be happy about. She sees it as a fight. Okay? So I'm just going to add a little note here. The word ring evokes images of a fighting ring. And therefore, suggests the same thing as strove. Okay. This next stanza, not a whole lot I want to talk about, but there's a few words that you're probably not familiar with. So, or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. So gossamer and tippet. A gossamer was like a nightgown, a really thin nightgown that women wore. And tippet is an old-fashioned shawl or a shoulder cape that you would wear over yourself. And tulle is it's really thin fabric that like you might see on a wedding dress. Okay, it's lacy and it's kind of coarse, but essentially the point of this is to show, point of this stanza is to show that, oh, and I guess you have to know, gossamers and tippets are something that women wore to go to bed in when this poem was written. So the fact that she was wearing a gossamer and a tippet, a nightgown essentially, suggests that she was asleep when death came for her. And she says, the dews drew quivering and chill. So we get the idea that she's cold, okay? They're in this carriage, she's cold. She was not dressed for the occasion, which then suggests then that she was not actually expecting death to come and get her, that this was a surprise. So the fact that she's wearing only a gossamer and tippet suggests that she was asleep when death came for her and was not prepared for their journey. One last thing I want to say. So coming back up to this stanza here, this would be, for example, a line I could give you in a quiz. If I gave you, we passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring, we passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun, and I just asked, okay, what's significant in this stanza? Then I would hope that you would tell me, okay, well, we have the repetition of we pass to suggest perpetual forward motion, to remind us that we're in a chariot, and then the use of the words strove and ring elicit images that we don't normally associate with children playing in a playground, which then suggests that this narrator doesn't see life as a gentle, enjoyable thing, but rather she sees it as a fight, a constant struggle. Okay? That's what you would be expected to know. And let's move on to our final two stanzas, where we realize actually where this lady is, where the narrator is when she's writing this poem, when she's thinking of these events. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So, again, I hope you pause the video and read this to yourself a few times so that you realize what she's actually saying. But I'm just going to speak through a few of the important points. So we paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. What kind of house is she talking about here? When do we see a swelling of the ground? She's talking about a graveyard, essentially. She's talking about when you bury someone in the ground and then you pile the dirt over them, right? There's a swelling there. The dirt is heaped up. She's talking about a gravesite. Okay? That in itself isn't super significant, but the fact that she calls it a house is. No. So using the word house to indicate Oi, are you here to do poetry? Are you here to read some poetry? Okay. So using the word house to indicate the place of burial is a clever move. Instead of using grave or tombstone, which might stir up images of finality and death, Dickinson uses a word that we associate with home. Your house is your home. It's your dwelling place. It's somewhere you go to live your life, whereas a tombstone or a graveyard is somewhere where you go to end your life. So again, just by the specific diction that she's using, we get the idea that this lady, that Emily Dickinson, or the narrator, is pretty darn comfortable with the idea of dying. In fact, she prefers it to living. Emily Dickinson's poems are pretty cool in that a lot of the time you have to separate the author from the narrator, but for her, she is her own narrator, so she is the person writing this poem as the author and as the voice behind the ideas. Okay, so where did I want to go from that? I don't know. It's just interesting. Emily Dickinson is the narrator here. Okay. So using the word house, she indicates again the fact that she's very comfortable with death. Death is not only a gentleman, he's not only kind and civil, but he's bringing her to her final home, a place where she can continue living. And we really get that sense by reading this last stanza here. Since then. What does she mean, since then? She's talking about since that day that death came for her. Since then, 'tis centuries. Centuries means hundreds of years. And yet, feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. So what she's saying here, what we realize is she's writing this poem from the afterlife. This is a dead person in the way we think of death. She's passed on from this life. She's now in the afterlife, remembering the day when death came for her in his chariot. Okay, so we realize here that the narrator is speaking to us from beyond the grave. Okay, and for her to say feels shorter than the day, for her to say the centuries that have been happening, the centuries that have passed in this afterlife feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. Kind of saying like, it's been great, honestly. Time flies when you're having fun. These centuries have just flown by. They seem shorter than the day that death took me. So again, we just get the sense that this author, that Emily Dickinson, is very comfortable with the idea of death. So our main key points, the narrator is very comfortable with the idea, and the man, or the personification, we'll say, of death. We understand that life was not very enjoyable for this lady. Why? We don't know. The poem doesn't go into that, but we do know that life wasn't enjoyable for her because of the words she uses to describe it, right? So we understand that life was not very enjoyable for this lady, in that even though she was surprised by death's visit, it was welcomed. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there. This took a lot longer than I thought it would, but actually, you know what? We would actually usually in class take about one full class for a poem, so I guess it's on par with that. But with that in mind, because we're online learning and because we're really trying to make everything pretty concise and just teach what's— video started going wacky there, so I'm not sure what you heard or not. No, it's doing it again. Okay. Okay, I think it's working. I forgot how long it takes to go through poems, so we're not going to go through every poem in the package I gave you. We're going to go through 3, okay? Just because as a department, as a school with all of this, we're really just trying to keep it down to the bare minimum of what we need to teach you so that you're successful next year. That being said, there's one last thing that's super interesting about this poem that I really want to mention. I'm not going to quiz you on it, but when you read this poem, and basically all of Emily Dickinson's poems, they have a very specific beat. So this one is written in iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. And let me just write this. Again, not notes you need to know for the quiz, just super interesting for all of those of you who love poetry. An iamb is a metrical, it's a metric, what's the word? Syllable, yeah. It's a metric syllable. So, Nicole has 2 syllables, because is 1 syllable. So they're different than syllables we think of, but you'll see what I mean. So this poem is written in iambic tetrameter, tetra meaning 4, and iambic trimeter, trimeter meaning 3. So, because I could not stop for death, 4 iambs in that line, he kindly stopped for me, 3 iambs. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Now, this is not done by accident either. The shifting between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter is done on purpose because when you hear it, it sounds like horse hooves going. So the metric meter of this poem, am I frozen again? Okay. So the metric meter of this poem is actually used on purpose to remind the reader that they're in a horse carriage the whole time that they're reading the poem. It's just another cool little fact about poetry, that the meter can also play into the meaning of the poem. Okay, I'm going to end there. Have a beautiful day.